Because of my husband's mistress. His mother looked at me with ice in her eyes and told me I was no longer welcome in their home. Because I dared to give birth to a daughter instead of the obedient silence they preferred, they dragged me outside into a raging snowstorm. Because I had no family left, no money they knew of, and a newborn only 3 days old, they thought I was powerless. They believed I would beg, break, or disappear quietly into the cold. They never imagined I had just inherited a fortune so vast it could erase them with a signature. And they certainly never suspected that within 24 hours, their world would begin to burn. I was still bleeding when they pushed me out the door. My body ached in a way that went deeper than muscle or bone, a raw, hollow pain that came from giving everything you had and being told it wasn't enough. The wind screamed across the driveway, slicing through the thin hospital coat I was still wearing, and my daughter let out a small, startled cry from inside the blanket pressed to my chest. I tightened my arms around her instinctively, my heart pounding with a fear so sharp it almost drowned out everything else. Snow stung my face, melting into my hair, soaking through my shoes within seconds. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a finality that echoed louder than the storm. My mother-in-law's voice rang in my ears, crisp and satisfied. You chose to embarrass this family. Now deal with the consequences. She had stood beside my husband as she said it, her hand resting on his arm like a claim of ownership. He didn't look at me, not once. His eyes were fixed somewhere over my shoulder, as if I were already gone. As if the woman he had sworn vows to, the woman who had just carried his child for 9 months, was nothing more than an inconvenience he wanted erased. The mistress watched from the window. I saw her silhouette framed by warm light, one hand resting casually on her hip, the other holding a glass of wine. She smiled, not wide or cruel, just smug, certain victorious. In that moment, something inside me hardened. Fear was still there, yes, but beneath it grew a quiet, terrifying calm. I walked. Each step felt like wading through knives. The snow was already up to my ankles, soaking my socks, numbing my feet until I could barely feel the ground. My daughter whimpered again, her tiny fingers curling weakly against my skin, and panic surged. She was too small for this, too new. I pressed my lips to her head, whispering nonsense, promises I didn't yet know how to keep. Mommy's here. Mommy's got you. Just a little longer. I didn't know where I was going at first. The road blurred through falling snow, streetlights glowing like distant, indifferent stars. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, then went silent. I didn't check it. Part of me already knew it wouldn't be him asking if we were safe. It would be something colder, something final. 20 minutes later, my legs gave out. I collapsed onto a snow-covered bus bench, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely adjust the blanket around my daughter. Tears froze on my cheeks before they could fall. I had never felt so small, so utterly erased. I thought of the delivery room 3 days earlier, of my husband standing stiffly by the window while the doctor placed our baby in my arms. It's a girl, they'd said, and his jaw had tightened just slightly, like the news was a minor inconvenience. That was when my phone rang. The screen lit up with a number I hadn't seen in years. My throat tightened as I answered, my voice barely working. Hello? There was a pause on the other end, then a voice I thought I'd never hear again. Calm, controlled, familiar in a way that made my chest ache. I'm so sorry it took us this long to find you. This is Mr. Hale, legal counsel for the Whitmore estate. We need to speak with you immediately. Your grandfather passed away yesterday. The world seemed to tilt. My grandfather, the man my mother had cut me off from when I married against her wishes. The man I'd been told wanted nothing to do with me. I swallowed hard, snow melting down my collar. I don't understand, I said. I can't talk right now. You need to listen carefully, he replied, his tone shifting. You are the sole heir. The entire estate. Liquid assets, holdings, trusts. The valuation is approximately $2.3 billion. The storm faded. The cold retreated. All I could hear was my daughter's soft breathing against my chest. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I closed my eyes and felt something deep and electric settle into place. Power. Not the loud, reckless kind, but the quiet certainty of someone who no longer had to beg. 24 hours later, I would remember the look on my mother-in-law's face when the locks on her house stopped working. I would remember my husband's voice shaking as his accounts froze, his job vanished, his carefully built life collapsed under the weight of truths he never bothered to learn. I would remember the mistress's smile disappearing when she realized she had attached herself to a sinking ship. But for that moment, sitting in the snow with my newborn child, I whispered the same promise again, only this time I meant it. No one will ever throw us out again. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and melted snow. They brought me in through the emergency entrance after a city bus driver spotted me on the bench and refused to leave until someone helped. I barely remember the ride, only the way the fluorescent lights streaked overhead and how my arms never loosened around my daughter. A nurse tried to take her from me to check her vitals, and I nearly screamed. My voice came out hoarse and feral, like something cornered. It took 3 people and a soft blanket to convince me she would be safer for just a minute. That was how fear lived in me now, sharp and absolute. They told me she was fine. Cold but fine. Healthy lungs. Strong heart. A fighter, one nurse whispered, smiling at me like I'd done something right. I clung to that word. Fighter. It sounded like permission. I lay there while warm fluids dripped into my veins, listening to the muted rhythm of hospital life. Somewhere nearby, a machine beeped steadily. Someone laughed softly down the hall. The world continued, indifferent to the fact that mine had just split cleanly in two. On the small plastic bassinet beside my bed, my daughter slept, her tiny chest rising and falling, unaware of how close we'd come to disappearing. An hour later, the man from the phone call arrived. Mr. Hale was tall, gray-haired, dressed in a coat that probably cost more than my wedding ring. He didn't look surprised to see me in a hospital bed, hair matted, eyes swollen. If anything, his expression softened. He pulled a chair close and spoke quietly, like he understood that my life had just been shattered and rearranged all at once. "Your grandfather never stopped looking for you," he said. "He kept tabs quietly. When your mother cut contact, he respected it publicly but made sure there were safeguards in place. Trusts. Contingencies. A final letter." He handed me a thick envelope. My name was written across it in my grandfather's familiar, careful handwriting. My fingers trembled as I opened it, my heart thudding harder with every fold of paper. "My dearest girl," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the world has likely not been kind to you. I am sorry for the years we lost. I was wrong to let pride and distance steal time we can never recover. Everything I built for family, and you're my family." The tears came then, silent and unstoppable. They soaked into the pillow as I read about his regrets, his quiet hope that one day I would find my way back to myself, even if I never found my way back to him. He wrote about strength, about choosing dignity when others chose cruelty, about never mistaking silence for weakness. Mr. Hale waited until I folded the letter back into the envelope, my hand steadier now. "We've secured accommodations for you," he said. "Somewhere private, safe, warm. There will be security. Medical staff if you want them. No one will know where you are unless you say so." I looked down at my daughter, at the way her lips twitched in sleep. I thought of the house I'd been thrown out of, the locks that had closed behind me, the people inside already rewriting the story to make themselves blameless. I nodded once. "Thank you." The penthouse overlooked the river, glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling. Heat hummed softly beneath polished stone floors. Everything was white and clean and impossibly calm. It felt like stepping into someone else's life, one I hadn't earned yet. A nurse helped me settle in, show me how to work the security panel, the emergency call buttons, the hidden nursery tucked just beyond the bedroom. That night, after everyone left, I stood barefoot in the living room, my daughter asleep against my shoulder, and watched the city lights flicker below. Somewhere out there, my husband was probably pacing, furious that I'd embarrassed him by disappearing. My mother-in-law was likely already calling relatives, spinning the story into something sharp and convenient. The mistress would be slipping into my place, wearing my robe, sleeping in my bed. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post. I didn't cry again. Instead, I listened. By morning, my phone was full. Missed calls, texts, voicemails, his number, his mother's. Unknown numbers I recognized as family friends who'd never bothered to check on me before. I didn't open them. Silence had protected me once, and now it would sharpen into something else. Mr. Hale returned with a team, an accountant, a security specialist, a woman who introduced herself as my personal liaison and spoke with the efficiency of someone used to rearranging lives. They laid everything out gently but clearly. The assets, the companies, the political ties, the leverage. You don't need to decide anything today, Mr. Hale said. But you should know this. Your husband's family business has significant exposure, debt, dependencies. They rely on partnerships they believe are stable. I smiled for the first time in days. It felt unfamiliar on my face. How unfortunate. He studied me carefully, then nodded. We can move as slowly or as quickly as you wish. Power doesn't require haste. By evening, the storm had passed. The city was quiet under a blanket of fresh snow, pristine and deceptive. I sat at the dining table, my daughter sleeping in a sling against my chest, documents spread out before me. Names, numbers, threads connecting everything they thought was secure. I traced one with my finger and thought of the way my mother-in-law's hand had shoved me forward, of my husband's silence, of the door slamming shut. 24 hours earlier, they had believed they were casting me into nothing. They had no idea they were giving me space. The first move wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There were no angry messages sent, no confrontation staged, no social media posts exposing betrayal or cruelty. That was what they would expect from a woman they believed had nothing left. Desperation, noise, emotion. Instead, I did nothing at all, and that unsettled them far more than any outburst could have. From the penthouse, I watched the city wake each morning, my daughter cradled against me, warm and safe. Nurses came and went quietly. Food appeared without me asking. Everything functioned smoothly, efficiently, like a well-oiled machine that existed solely to support me. For the first time since I could remember, I wasn't reacting. I was observing. My husband broke first. His first voicemail was irritated, clipped. "Where are you? You can't just disappear like this. My mother is furious." The second was sharper. "This has gone far enough. You embarrassed us." The third came late at night, his voice lower, edged with something close to panic. "The bank flagged our joint account. Call me. Now." I deleted them without listening all the way through. By mid-morning, Mr. Hale called. "Everything is in motion," he said calmly. "The initial asset separation is complete. Accounts tied to your husband and his mother's discretionary access have been frozen pending review. It's all legal, all clean. They can still cover essentials, but the excess has stopped flowing." I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. Somewhere across the city, my mother-in-law was probably standing in her immaculate kitchen, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against a marble countertop, wondering why her card had declined. She had always prided herself on control, on knowing exactly where everyone stood in relation to her. This would feel like the ground shifting beneath her feet. That afternoon, my liaison arranged a secure video call. On the screen appeared a man I recognized immediately, though we'd never met. My husband's boss. The man who had congratulated him at our wedding, who'd toasted us at corporate events, who'd smiled indulgently whenever my mother-in-law spoke about legacy and family values. "Thank you for taking the time," he said, his tone formal, cautious. "We've recently become aware of some changes in our investment landscape." I tilted my head slightly, letting just enough of my grandfather's steel show through my expression. "Yes, I've been reviewing my holdings." He swallowed. "Of course. We value your grandfather's legacy. And yours. We'd like to discuss continuity." "Continuity," I echoed softly. An interesting word. The call ended with promises of follow-ups, meetings, restructuring. When the screen went dark, I felt a strange sense of detachment. These people weren't villains. They were simply parts of a system that rewarded power and punished weakness. For years, my husband and his family had assumed they were on the right side of that equation. They were wrong. In the early evening, security alerted me to someone at the building's entrance. My mother-in-law. I watched her on the monitor, her fur coat dusted with snow, lips pressed into a thin, furious line. She spoke animatedly to the concierge, gesturing sharply, her voice carrying even through muted audio. She demanded. She insisted. She named me like a claim. I didn't let her up. Instead, I sent a single message through my liaison. I am unavailable. Please direct all communication through counsel. The reaction was immediate. She stepped back from the desk, as if struck, her face flushing red beneath layers of makeup. She pulled out her phone, dialing furiously. My phone lit up seconds later with her name. I turned it face down. That night, as I rocked my daughter to sleep, memories surfaced unbidden. Holidays spent navigating sharp comments and passive-aggressive smiles. The way my mother-in-law would inspect my cooking, my appearance, my parenting, always finding something lacking. The way my husband would sit silently beside her, letting it happen. I had mistaken that silence for peace, for compromise. I knew better now. The next morning brought the mistress. She didn't come herself, of course. She sent a message from an unknown number, dripping with false concern. I heard what happened. Are you okay? This has all gotten so out of hand. Maybe we can talk woman to woman. I almost laughed. Instead, I forwarded the message to my legal team. Add this to the file, I wrote. No response. By noon, the first article appeared. Small, buried in a business section most people skimmed. It mentioned a sudden restructuring within a mid-sized firm tied to my husband's family, noted an unexpected withdrawal of capital, hinted at internal disagreements. Nothing explosive, nothing defamatory, but it was enough. The calls escalated. My husband's voice cracked in one voicemail, anger giving way to fear. What did you do? You're ruining everything. You don't understand how this works. You're hurting yourself, too. I held my daughter close, her warmth grounding me. I understand exactly how this works, I thought. I've been watching it my whole life. That evening, Mr. Hale visited again, this time with a faint smile he didn't bother to hide. Your husband has requested mediation, he said, through his attorney. He's concerned. Concerned. The word felt small for what he must be feeling as his carefully curated life began to fracture. Not yet, I said. Let him sit with it. Outside, the city glowed, unaware of the quiet shift happening behind closed doors. Power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply changed hands while everyone else was too busy assuming nothing ever would. They tried to regain control the only way they knew how, by rewriting the story. It began subtly, almost clumsily. A mutual acquaintance sent a carefully worded message asking if I was doing okay and whether the stress of childbirth had been harder than expected. Another hinted that people were worried about my emotional stability. By evening, it was clearer. The narrative was forming. I wasn't wronged. I was overwhelmed, fragile, unreliable. A woman who'd cracked under pressure and run away with a newborn in the middle of winter. I watched it unfold with detached interest, like observing an experiment I already knew the outcome of. My mother-in-law was an expert at this. She had spent decades shaping perceptions, weaponizing concern, turning cruelty into supposed care. When I first married her son, she'd warned me with a smile that in this family, reputation was everything. I hadn't understood then that she meant hers. Mr. Hale confirmed it the next morning. We've intercepted several attempts to contact medical professionals connected to your delivery, he said. Requests for records. Inquiries framed as concern. I felt a flicker of anger then, hot and sharp. Not for myself, but for my daughter. They were willing to question my sanity to protect their image. Willing to undermine a new mother to regain leverage. Shut down, I said quietly. It's already handled, he replied. And there's more. Your husband has moved out of the house. He's staying at a hotel. I pictured it easily. Him pacing a generic room, tie loosened, phone in hand, finally realizing that the people he'd relied on to clean up his messes couldn't fix this. That silence, his favorite tool, had stopped working. By afternoon, the pressure became more direct. He showed up. Security notified me as soon as his car entered the underground garage. My heart rate spiked instinctively, a reflex I hadn't yet trained out of my body. Part of me wanted to refuse, to keep him out the way I'd been kept out. But another part, steadier now, knew this moment mattered. Let him up, I said, but have security nearby. He looked smaller when he stepped into the penthouse. Not physically, but something in his posture had shifted. The confidence he wore like armor was gone, replaced by tight shoulders and restless eyes. He took in the space, the view, the quiet luxury, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked uncertain. "You're living here?" he asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "For now," I replied evenly. He ran a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you tell me about any of this? The inheritance, the money. We could have handled this together." I almost smiled at the word together. I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. Instead, he paced, words spilling faster as panic seeped through his practiced composure. "My mother's accounts are frozen. The firm is asking questions. People are talking. This is getting out of hand." "Out of whose hand?" I asked. He stopped, finally looking at me. At our daughter, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. At the woman he'd allowed to be shoved into his snowstorm days earlier. His jaw tightened. "You didn't have to go this far." I tilted my head. "How far is that?" "Far enough that you noticed?" Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The mental math of apologies weighed against losses. When he spoke again, his tone softened, almost pleading. "My mother didn't mean it. She was angry. Emotional. You know how she gets." I didn't know. I'd always known. "And you?" I asked quietly. "What did you mean?" He looked away. I didn't think she'd actually. He trailed off, as if the memory of me standing in the snow with our newborn had only just fully formed in his mind. I stood then, every movement deliberate. "Let me be very clear. You don't get to minimize what happened. You don't get to excuse it. And you don't get to ask me to fix the consequences of choices you made while I was bleeding, exhausted, and holding our child." His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he had no response. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I continued. "I'm doing this because I finally understand something. I was never protected in that house. I was tolerated. And the moment I became inconvenient, I was disposable." "That's not true," he said weakly. I met his gaze. "Then why was it so easy?" The question hung between us like a verdict. He left shortly after, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. Security escorted him out without incident. When the elevator doors closed, I felt a surprising wave of relief. Not triumph. Relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop holding your breath. That evening, my mother-in-law made her move. She went public. A carefully crafted statement circulated through social circles, dripping with concern and sanctimony. It spoke of a family disagreement, of worries for the well-being of a new mother, of prayers and privacy. It painted her as patient, generous, victimized. I read it once, then handed my phone to Mr. Hale. "Release the counterstatement," I said. It was short, factual, devastating in its restraint. On the night of my discharge from the hospital, while still recovering from childbirth, I and my newborn were forcibly removed from our marital home during a severe snowstorm at the direction of my husband and his mother. Any claims to the contrary are false. Legal proceedings are ongoing. No embellishment, no emotion, just truth. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Phones rang. Messages flooded in. People who had smiled at my baby shower suddenly wanted clarification. Allies quietly shifted sides. Silence became suspicion. Concern became outrage. By midnight, my mother-in-law's statement had vanished. By morning, her social calendar was empty. I stood by the window as dawn broke, my daughter stirring softly in my arms. For years, I had believed survival meant endurance, keeping the peace, absorbing the damage quietly. I knew better now. Endurance without boundaries wasn't strength. It was erasure. The backlash didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through the cracks, through quiet withdrawals of support and subtle shifts in tone. Invitations that were suddenly postponed, calls that went unanswered. My husband's family had built their influence on loyalty, unspoken rules, favors remembered, alliances maintained over decades. And now, those loyalties were being tested. It started with the board. Mr. Hale sat across from me at the dining table, a thin folder open between us. Your husband's company has called an emergency meeting, he said. Several board members are uneasy. They weren't aware of the full extent of your grandfather's involvement, nor how much stability depended on it. I traced the edge of the table with my finger, my daughter sleeping nearby, blissfully unaware of corporate politics and family betrayals. What are they saying? That they feel misled, that the risk profile has changed, and that without your support, the company's future looks uncertain. I nodded. Good. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years. My sister-in-law. She'd always hovered at the edges, smiling when expected, disappearing when things turned ugly. The text was brief. We need to talk. Mom is spiraling. You don't understand what you're doing to her. I stared at the screen, then typed a single reply. I understand exactly what I'm doing. I didn't send anything else. By evening, the mistress surfaced again, this time not hiding behind concern. A tabloid-friendly blog published a piece heavy with implication and light on facts. It spoke of a wealthy benefactor, of a calculated woman leveraging tragedy, of questions about timing and motive. My name wasn't mentioned, but the connections were obvious to anyone paying attention. Mr. Hale was already on it. We can shut this down quickly, he assured me. But I hesitated. No, I said after a moment. Let's circulate. He raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Yes, because lies collapse faster when they're forced into the light. The comments were brutal at first. Accusations, speculation, thinly veiled misogyny disguised as skepticism. I read none of them. Instead, I watched who shared the article, who liked it, who stayed silent. Patterns emerged quickly. People revealed themselves without realizing it. 2 days later, the correction dropped. Not an apology, not a retraction. A correction quietly appended at the bottom of the original post. It cited verified documentation, legal filings, timelines, hospital records, witness statements. The story unraveled thread by thread, exposing the article for what it was, a rushed attempt to discredit a woman who refused to stay small. The blog went offline within hours. That same day, my husband called again. I almost didn't answer. Almost. His voice was different this time. Stripped down. No anger. No bluster. Just exhaustion. The board voted to remove me as interim director, he said flatly. They're restructuring. Mom's furious. She says you've destroyed everything. I held my daughter close, feeling her warmth, her steady presence. I didn't destroy anything, I said. I stopped holding it together for people who never cared if it broke me. There was a long pause. I never thought she'd actually do it, he admitted quietly. I never thought she'd push you out like that. And yet, she did. I'm sorry, he said, the words heavy and inadequate. I should have protected you. I closed my eyes. Protection after the fact was just another form of regret. I hope you understand something, I said softly. This isn't about punishment. It's about truth. And the truth is, I can't trust you to stand between me and your family. He didn't argue. That hurt more than any denial could have. The next week was a cascade. Vendors pulled out. Credit tightened. The company's stock dipped, then slid. My mother-in-law's friends stopped returning her calls. Invitations dried up. Her carefully curated image began to fracture, not because of what I said, but because of what others saw when pressure was applied. One afternoon, as snow melted into slush outside the penthouse, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. A woman's voice, tight with controlled anger. This is Margaret. We need to meet. I knew who she was immediately. One of my mother-in-law's closest allies. A gatekeeper in their social world. I agreed on my terms. She arrived the next day, impeccably dressed, eyes sharp. You've made your point, she said without preamble. This has gone far enough. I smiled politely. Has it? She leaned forward. Families survive because people know when to stop. You're burning bridges you may need someday. I met her gaze steadily. I was pushed out into a snowstorm with my newborn. Tell me, Margaret, exactly which bridge I'm supposed to mourn. Her mouth tightened. This could have been handled privately. It was handled privately, I replied. I was removed privately. The consequences are public. She left shortly after, her composure cracking just enough to confirm what I already knew. They were afraid, not of me as a person, but of what I represented. A woman who refused to absorb damage quietly was a threat to the entire structure. That night, I stood by the window again, the city reflected in the glass. My daughter slept peacefully, her future unwritten. I thought of loyalty, of how often it was demanded downward and rarely offered upward, of how easily people justified cruelty when it preserved their comfort. I had paid the price of loyalty with my dignity once. I wouldn't do it again. By the time the full consequences reached them, it was already too late to contain the damage. What my husband's family had mistaken for a temporary disruption was turning into a structural collapse, the kind that happens when a system has been rotting quietly beneath the surface for years. I hadn't caused it. I had simply stopped holding it up. The first lawsuit landed on a Tuesday morning. Mr. Hale called early, his voice calm, but edged with something close to satisfaction. A former partner has filed suit against the company. Breach of fiduciary duty. He's citing undisclosed financial dependencies and misrepresentation of backing. I closed my eyes briefly. Once one person spoke up, others would follow. They always did. Fear kept people silent until it didn't. By noon, 2 more followed. One from a supplier who claimed they'd been pressured into unfavorable terms under false pretenses. Another from a minority investor who alleged deliberate obfuscation of risk. Each filing referenced the same core issue: the illusion of stability. The belief that powerful people would always be there to absorb the fallout. That belief was gone. My mother-in-law tried to intervene. She always did, inserting herself where she believed authority alone should command obedience. She called old contacts, demanded meetings, reminded people of favors exchanged decades earlier. For the first time, it didn't work. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. The language people used with her shifted from deferential to cautious, then to distant. She showed up at my building again. This time, she didn't shout at the concierge. She didn't demand. She waited. I watched her on the monitor, standing stiffly near the entrance, her coat buttoned wrong, her hair slightly out of place. It struck me then how much of her power had always been performance. Remove the audience, and she was just a woman aging in a world that no longer needed her approval. I allowed her up. She stepped into the penthouse like someone entering unfamiliar territory, eyes darting, taking in the view, the quiet, the absence of chaos. She didn't comment on any of it. She went straight to the point. "You've made your point," she said, voice clipped. "This has gone far enough." I gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "You're humiliating this family," she continued. "You're destroying your husband's future, your daughter's future." I looked at her steadily. "You forfeited the right to speak about my daughter the moment you pushed her into the snow." Her lips thinned. "I did what was necessary." Necessary for whom? She hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "For order. For discipline. You were emotional, unstable. There were things you didn't understand." I felt something settle in my chest, then a clarity so sharp it almost felt like relief. "You don't get to rewrite what happened," I said quietly. "You don't get to decide when cruelty becomes acceptable." She scoffed. "You think this makes you powerful?" I smiled faintly. "No, power was never the goal. Safety was." She finally sat, her composure slipping. "You're burning everything down," she said, her voice lowering. "And for what? Pride?" I leaned forward slightly. "For my life. And my child's. And because for the first time, I don't have to choose between survival and silence." She stared at me, seeing something she hadn't before. Not defiance. Finality. "If you continue this," she said slowly, "you'll regret it." I shook my head. "No. What I regret is ever believing you would protect me." She left without another word. 2 days later, the firm announced a restructuring. My husband was officially removed from his position, publicly framed as a strategic realignment, privately understood as a sacrifice. The board needed someone to blame, someone visible enough to satisfy investors without implicating themselves too deeply. He called me that night. I didn't answer immediately. When I did, his voice was hoarse. "It's over," he said. "Everything she built, everything I thought we had, it's gone." I listened without interrupting. This wasn't my victory. It was his reckoning. I never thought she'd turn on me, he admitted. Not like this. I thought of all the times he'd watch her turn on me and said nothing. Some lessons arrived late. I hope you find your footing, I said finally. For our daughter's sake. There was silence on the line, heavy with things we would never undo. Then, quietly, thank you for not taking everything. I closed my eyes. I took what I needed. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since the birth. Not because the danger was gone, but because I trusted myself to face it now. I had security, resources, clarity, but more than that, I had boundaries. In the days that followed, the fallout continued. My mother-in-law's social circle evaporated. Her carefully maintained relevance dissolved as people recalibrated their alliances. Without access to capital, without a son in power, without the illusion of control, she became exactly what she'd always feared. Ignored. I watched it all from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a strange sense of inevitability. This was what happened when people built their identity on dominance rather than decency. One evening, as I rocked my daughter near the window, watching rain streak down the glass, I realized something else had changed. The anger that had fueled me in those first days was gone. In its place was something steadier. Purpose. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. Once the collapse reached a certain point, it stopped being dramatic and became administrative. That was the part most people never saw, the slow, methodical untangling of lives that had been knotted together by habit rather than intention. Court filings replaced shouting. Schedules replaced chaos. Decisions replaced fear. I moved first, not physically. I stayed in the penthouse, where my daughter was thriving, gaining weight, sleeping longer stretches, her small fists uncurling as if her body finally believed we were safe. I moved internally, emotionally, severing threads I'd once clung to for survival. My legal team formalized separation agreements. Clean, precise, no public spectacle, no accusations that could be twisted into character attacks, just facts and boundaries. When the documents were delivered, my husband signed quickly. He didn't negotiate. He didn't argue. That told me everything I needed to know about how exhausted he was by the years of pleasing his mother at the expense of his own marriage. Custody discussions followed. He asked for shared custody out of obligation, not conviction. His questions revealed it. How often would his mother be allowed to see the baby? What holidays would be expected? What traditions would be maintained? I answered calmly. Supervised visits only. No unscheduled contact. No overnight stays. Traditions would be discussed later, when trust had been rebuilt. He nodded, relief and disappointment crossing his face in equal measure. Part of him wanted me to be unreasonable, to confirm the story he'd been telling himself about my instability. My composure denied him that comfort. My mother-in-law tried once more. She sent a letter, handwritten, carefully composed. It spoke of misunderstandings, of generational differences, of intentions misread. It offered apologies without accountability, regret without responsibility. It never once mentioned the snowstorm. I returned it unopened. By then, the world had shifted its attention. Scandals were replaced by newer scandals. People moved on, but consequences remained, quiet and permanent. My husband found work eventually, not at the level he'd once enjoyed, not with the prestige he'd been groomed to expect. A smaller firm, less influence, more accountability. He struggled with it, I knew, but there was a strange humility in his voice when he spoke about his days. Less entitlement, more awareness. My mother-in-law retreated into bitterness. She blamed me publicly, privately, endlessly. But without an audience, her words lost their power. People tolerated her outbursts the way one tolerates bad weather. Unpleasant, unavoidable, temporary. I began rebuilding my life deliberately, not as a reaction to loss, but as an assertion of presence. I met with advisors about my grandfather's foundation, redirecting funds toward maternal health, legal advocacy for women displaced by domestic situations, emergency housing for new mothers. I insisted on anonymity where possible, not out of shame, but because I understood now how attention distorted intention. I enrolled in therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand how I'd learned to accept erasure as love. Sessions were difficult, uncomfortable, clarifying. Patterns emerged. Childhood lessons about obedience. Marriage dynamics that rewarded silence. Generational expectations masquerading as tradition. Naming them weakened them. As spring arrived, the city softened. Snow melted into green. Light lingered longer in the evenings. My daughter laughed for the first time, a small, surprise sound that shattered something open inside me. I held her close, tears blurring my vision, overwhelmed by the simplicity of joy untainted by fear. One afternoon, I received an invitation. A quiet luncheon hosted by women I recognized from various industries. Investors, founders, philanthropists. The note was brief. "We've been watching. We'd like to talk." I went cautious but curious. The room was warm, the conversation direct. They didn't ask about the scandal. They asked about my vision, my values, what I wanted to build rather than what I'd survived. It was the first time in years anyone had asked me who I was without attaching me to someone else. When I returned home that evening, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Belonging. Not the conditional kind, contingent on silence or compliance. The kind rooted in mutual respect. My husband called that night. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said. "I mean that." I believed him. That was new. "I hope you are too," I replied. And for the first time, I meant it without bitterness. I ended the call and stood by the window, my daughter asleep in my arms. The city hummed below, indifferent and alive. I realized then that revenge had never been the point. Neither had punishment. The point was reclamation. Of space. Of voice. Of self. I had been pushed out into a storm and forced to choose between freezing and walking forward. I chose forward. And in doing so, I discovered that the life waiting for me was larger, quieter, and infinitely more honest than the one I'd been taught to protect at all costs by the time summer arrived. The urgency that had once driven every decision was gone. In its place was a measured rhythm, a life no longer organized around avoidance or appeasement. I woke when my daughter stirred, not to dread, but to purpose. Her needs anchored my days, simple and undeniable. Feed, hold, teach, protect. In that order. The world adjusted to me rather than the other way around. The legal matters settled quietly. No drawn-out battles, no scorched earth tactics. My attorneys moved with precision, and resistance evaporated quickly once it became clear I wasn't interested in spectacle. That confused people more than aggression ever could have. They were prepared for a fight. They weren't prepared for certainty. My husband signed the final documents on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't attend. There was no need. When my lawyer called to confirm it was done, I felt nothing dramatic. No surge of victory. No grief. Just a closing of a chapter that had already ended emotionally long before the paperwork caught up. That evening, I took my daughter for a walk along the river. The air was warm, the path busy with joggers and families. No one recognized me. No one cared who I was or what I'd survived. I love that. I love being anonymous in a world that once treated my presence as negotiable. People still speculated, of course. They always would. But speculation without access was harmless. The more I refused to explain myself, the less interesting I became as a subject of gossip. Silence, when chosen, was powerful. The foundation work expanded quickly. Word spread in the quiet way it does among people who actually do things. Programs were funded, shelters upgraded, legal clinics staffed. I attended meetings not as a benefactor seeking praise, but as a participant asking hard questions. How are women actually falling through the cracks? Where does the system fail first? What does safety look like in real terms, not slogans? The answers reshaped me. I learned how often new mothers were dismissed as hysterical, how frequently family disputes masked violence, how many women stayed because leaving meant homelessness, legal vulnerability, or losing their children. I saw my own story reflected back at me in fragments, and the recognition hardened my resolve. This was what power was for. Not control, not revenge, capacity. One afternoon, my mother-in-law's name surfaced again. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she'd been asking questions about my foundation, about whether reconciliation might be possible. The word almost made me laugh, as if forgiveness were a transaction, something earned by time rather than accountability. I felt no urge to respond. My husband asked once, tentatively, whether his mother could see our daughter. Supervised. Briefly. I agreed, with conditions so clear there could be no misinterpretation. The visit was stiff, awkward, carefully observed. My mother-in-law held the baby like a foreign object, uncertain, resentful, stripped of authority. When it ended, she left without protest. That told me she understood, finally, where she stood. It wasn't enough to repair what she'd broken, but it was enough to prevent further harm. As the months passed, invitations arrived. Panels, boards, conversations framed around leadership and resilience. I declined most. I accepted a few, only those that allowed me to speak plainly without being turned into an inspirational symbol or a cautionary tale. I refused to sanitize my story for comfort. Strength without honesty was just another performance. One evening, as autumn edged closer, I received a message from a woman I didn't know. She wrote that she'd read about a case funded by my foundation, that she'd been thrown out of her home weeks after giving birth, that she'd thought she was alone until she realized someone had built a door where there'd been none before. I cried then, quietly, holding my daughter as she slept, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was the echo that mattered. I thought back to that night in the snow, to the fear that had nearly swallowed me whole, to the certainty with which I'd been dismissed. They had believed power belonged to them because it always had. They had mistaken habit for inevitability. They were wrong. Power, I learned, wasn't loud. It didn't need witnesses. It didn't demand submission. It created space and then defended it. My daughter would grow up knowing that. She would know that love did not require endurance of harm. That family was defined by protection, not proximity. That silence was a choice, not a duty. And that walking away from cruelty was not failure, but clarity. As I put her down that night, tucking the blanket around her small body, I felt a deep, steady calm. The kind that comes when fear no longer dictates the shape of your life. I had been cast out into a storm and told I would not survive. Instead, I learned how to build shelter. By the time winter returned, it no longer felt like an enemy. Snow fell softly against the glass instead of howling through my bones. The memory of that first storm still lived in me, but it no longer controlled me. Trauma, I learned, didn't disappear. It transformed. It became knowledge. It became boundaries. It became instinct sharpened by survival. My daughter was nearly a year old when she took her first steps. She wobbled across the living room, arms outstretched, eyes wide with determination. I sat on the floor, heart pounding, afraid to breathe too loudly in case I startled her. When she fell, she didn't cry. She looked at me instead, checking my reaction. I smiled, steady and encouraging, and she pushed herself back up. That moment stayed with me. Children learn strength by watching how safety responded to failure. I thought often about what I was modeling for her. Not perfection, not dominance, but agency. The knowledge that if something hurt, she could say so. That if someone crossed a line, she could step back. That love never required self-erasure. The final legal threads tied themselves off quietly. Settlements were reached. Non-disclosure agreements signed. The last remnants of my former life were packed into labeled boxes and archived away. I kept nothing sentimental. Objects that once carried meaning lost at the moment I stopped associating pain with loyalty. I heard updates occasionally, secondhand. My ex-husband was rebuilding in a smaller city now. Slower pace, less prestige, more presence. He attended every supervised visit, never late, always gentle. He had learned, too late for us, but perhaps not too late for himself, what silence actually cost. My former mother-in-law aged visibly. Power had been her mirror, and without it, she seemed unsure who she was. Her attempts to reclaim relevance fell flat. People remembered, not the statements, not the spin, The image of a woman and newborn in a snowstorm had embedded itself into the collective consciousness in a way no rebrand could erase. I felt no satisfaction in that. What I felt was distance. The foundation expanded internationally. Legal partnerships formed. Emergency response systems refined. I traveled selectively, always with my daughter, always with control over my schedule. I refused to be separated from her for optics or convenience. That, too, was a choice born of clarity. At one conference, a woman asked me what moment defined my transformation. She expected a dramatic answer. The inheritance, the confrontation, the collapse. I told her the truth. It was the moment I realized no one was coming to save me. That understanding had been terrifying. It had also been freeing. When you accept that rescue is not guaranteed, you stop waiting. You act. I taught my daughter words as carefully as I taught her steps. Safe. Stop. No. Again. She learned them quickly, delighted by the power of being understood. I watched her absorb the world with curiosity rather than fear, and I knew I had broken a cycle without ever naming it aloud. Sometimes, late at night, I revisited my grandfather's letter. His words had aged well. Strength, dignity, impact. He hadn't given me wealth as a weapon. He had given it as insulation, a way to ensure I never had to barter my safety for survival again. I used it accordingly. The world continued its churn. New scandals, new villains, new victims. I didn't insert myself into every battle. I didn't need to. Knowing when not to engage was as important as knowing when to stand firm. One quiet evening, I received a message from my ex-husband. A picture, our daughter laughing, mid-giggle, hair sticking up wildly. Thank you, he wrote, for not turning me into the enemy, for letting me learn. I stared at the photo for a long time before replying. Learn well, I wrote back. That's all that matters now. I didn't know what the future would hold. No one ever did. But I knew this. I would never again confuse endurance with love. I would never again accept proximity as protection. And I would never again allow anyone to decide my worth based on how quietly I suffered. The storm had not destroyed me. It had revealed me. Section 10. The line that will never be crossed again. There is a moment after everything settles when you realize the story is no longer about what was done to you. It is about what you will never allow again. I felt it one quiet morning as I watched my daughter play on the rug, stacking blocks with serious concentration. The past was no longer pressing against my chest. It was behind me, fully formed, understood, contained. I had inherited more than money. I had inherited responsibility, not to dominate, not to punish, not to prove anything to people who had already revealed who they were. My responsibility was simpler and far heavier, to make sure the cycle ended with me. I no longer checked for messages with tension. I no longer anticipated confrontation. The people who once believed they could discard me had faded into the background noise of a life I was actively building. Their opinions carried no weight because they carried no consequence. Sometimes power looks like retaliation. Sometimes it looks like walking away untouched. I chose the second. When my daughter looked up at me and smiled, unafraid, secure, certain that I would always be there, I knew the truth with absolute clarity. They had tried to break me at my most vulnerable moment. Instead, they gave me the reason and the resolve to become unbreakable. And that was the inheritance that mattered most. I was pushed into the cold believing I would disappear quietly, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. Instead, I learned that survival isn't loud, revenge isn't the point, and true power doesn't need permission or applause. It lives in the moment you stop begging to be chosen and start choosing yourself. I didn't rebuild my life to prove them wrong. I rebuilt it so my child would never learn that love requires suffering, silence, or endurance of cruelty. They thought they ended my story that night in the snow. In truth, they only forced me to begin it.